got quite a bit I want to try to cover today. And it's not just this stuff, it's also getting into, if not discussing, all of lawn vol. So let's kind of pick up where the Old English period ended, 1066. I'm not going to say anything else about the Norman conquest other than it occurred in 1066. William then rules for about 20 years, and it takes him about 20 years to solidify his rule. I mean, he's putting down the Anglo-Saxon nobility, starting castles throughout England. A lot of those, the remains of those castles that he began, you can see one of the greatest ones is in Warwickshire. Well, if you go to Castle of Warwick in Warwickshire, the castle that you see there today doesn't date from William the Conqueror's time. But you'll go inside and you'll see a big mound of dirt. That's what dates from William the Conqueror's time. It's the remains of his original castle. So he has a son who then rules for a little while. He has a son who then rules. And I've got this included from about 1130 to, I've got the actual dates, where are they? 1135 to 1154, there's a civil war between two descendants of William, a guy named Stephen and a woman named Matilda, okay, a queen. They're fighting against each other. In the entry for the Peterborough version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, there's 5 major versions of the Chronicle. And by versions, I mean places where the Chronicle was kept, okay? Each of these kind of did a rolling annual entry for what occurred during this year, all right? In the Peterborough copy of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the year 1135, the entry for that year, not because of the content of what it says, all right, but because of how the language is used for the first time in that entry. That's the first quote-unquote datable Middle English document. Part of that's because there's a huge reliance on prepositions, things like that. Prepositions, articles. Prior to the reliance on prepositions and articles, the language was heavily inflected. Things like dative case and accusative case, to something, with something, etc. That was indicated by an inflectional ending on a word, on a noun. Beginning around this period, 1135 or so, we see those inflections have already dropped off. And now you get emphasis on use of prepositions and such, okay? It's the only reason I've got that down there. So that's the first instance of recordable, datable Middle English, okay? Bear in mind, with the Norman conquest, what entered Britain, England? French. Norman French, okay? French became the dominant language. And what I mean by dominant is the language of the upper class, the language of government, the language of, if you want to succeed in life, you better learn French, okay? That lasted for about 300 years. It would be the equivalent of today, let's say, pick your global adversary. It's not really Russia anymore, it's China. It's becoming China, let's say. It'd be like China overtaking the United States, defeating the United States, all right? And Chinese becoming, let's say Mandarin Chinese, because there's more than one version of Chinese. Mandarin Chinese becoming the dominant dialect for government, education, law, culture, etc. So those of us who didn't know Mandarin Chinese, what's going to happen to us? Where are we going to find ourselves on that socioeconomic totem pole? We're way down at the bottom, okay? Those people who spoke native English, they were down at the bottom for about 300 years. Damn, okay? Exactly right. That is why That is the reason. That's the main part of the reason why English spelling today is so chaotic and doesn't make a lick of sense. Okay? Because French became the dominant language. Huge number of French words were borrowed into the English language during this period. Over 10,000. Okay? And when those words were borrowed in, native English words that those words replaced died out. Most of the time. There are many instances where we retain the native English word, and yet we also have the French word. For example, cow and pig. Okay? Native English words. When the French comes in, there starts to be made a distinction between the animal out in the field and what you put on your plate. So you don't put cow on your plate. What do you put? Beef. Beef. Okay? You don't put pig on your plate, you put pork on your plate. You don't put, I don't remember the French word, but you don't put mutton, which is English, on your plate. You put whatever the French word is for sheep or lamb. And again, I'm just drawing a blank. I used to know that. Drawing a total blank. We also saw at the same time enter a whole bunch of different words for colors that the native English didn't have. Native English had for red, red. French brought in scarlet, vermilion, and other terms. French brought in other terms for cooking that the English did not use. Okay? Like broiling and roasting and all those different kinds of things. A huge number of words that we have for cultural items, like clothing, for example, comes entirely from French. Okay? About 7,500 of those French words that were brought in, we still use today. One of the things that happens as a result of this is, and I don't usually go into this, and I'm not going to go into it for very long. The Old English native facility for creating words pretty much dies out. Because in Old English, you could take this word and just pack them together and you create a new word. Beowulf is full of several of those kinds of words, where it's the only instance of that word ever being used. The poet just jams things together. That gets revived in the Elizabethan period, because we have the greatest neologist in the English language living during the Elizabethan period. His name is William Shakespeare. He created over 1,700 of the words that he used in all of his works. It was something like 1/8 of the then average known vocabulary. I mean, Shakespeare just creates out of whole cloth, okay? So, that's part of the effect of the Norman Conquest. By 1350, back up for just a moment. So, if you want to get ahead in society, what do? Learn French, okay? There's another reason to learn French. If you're in trade of any sorts, you have to learn French. So, people are learning French, okay, at the beginning to get ahead in society. By the time 1300 or so rolls around, French is now the native language of the upper class, okay? Or by 1300. And then interestingly, by 1350, and we know this because of the documents that survive and such, by 1350, French is taught as a foreign language. That is, people in the upper crust of society, they're no longer learning French at home. They're no longer hearing it, which tells us by that point, by 1350, English has already risen back up and become the dominant language. Because there's a different kinds. When people are learning a language, you do two things, okay? One thing you do is, as you're talking, if you're learning that language, and you're talking with somebody in that new language, what do you often find yourself doing? Or if you go and visit a foreign country that does not have your native language as its native language, what do you find yourself doing? You'll be trying to speak in that new language, and you will revert, because you can't think of a word, you'll revert to your native language. Okay? So we see early on in this period French words being brought in, okay, because they're accepted, etc. Okay? But later on, we see those words no longer being brought in. And what we start to see is kind of a mixture, portmanteau, so to speak, between French and English words. So by 1350, English has become dominant again. It is now the language of Parliament, for example. From 1100 to 1300, French is the language of Parliament. I mean, the very name, Parliament, is French. If you're going to go back to the Old English version, probably the closest would be the Witan, W-I-T-N, which was the King's Council of Advisors. Council, French. Okay? So many of the words we use in everyday modern English are French in origin. And we didn't even talk about, back in the Old English period, the effect of Viking invasions. Because an awful lot of words that we use today are Old Norse. Like the stuff, if you look out the window and look up in the Old Norse, the word sky, it's Old Norse. I comes from Old Norse. Doesn't come from French, doesn't come from Latin. Skin, we have verb forms that come from Old Norse. It's the only language that interacted with English that changed the grammar. French did not change the grammar at all. Changed the lexicon, changed the vocabulary hugely, changed the spelling because of that, but it didn't change the grammar. If you say, I am going to the store, the ing, it comes from Old Norse. If you say, they was going to the store, you're actually speaking native Old English with the was part. But by using they, that's Old Norse. Those third personal plural pronouns that begin with th, those are Old Norse. Okay? We was Old English. We were and the are form, those come from Norse. Okay? That's a change in actual grammar. That's not a change just in vocabulary. All right? So jump ahead a few years to 1154. Stephen, if I remember correctly, actually eventually puts down Matilda, and his son, Henry II, becomes king in 1154. He reigns for 25 years. Okay? Marries Eleanor of Aquitaine. Aquitaine, large province of France. When he marries her, he also becomes king, essentially, of that area of France. So, but you've got the king of France, per se, and then Henry II, who has very large land holding now. That introduces a bit of friction. Okay? This is going to reach its head, 1184 to 89, this is going to reach its head under John I, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So, why do we talk about Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine? One, Henry II is the first Plantagenet king. His last name was Plantagenet, essentially, okay? Who introduces a whole line of kings. I don't have them all down here. They're in the back of your book. I can't remember what page. And it's the introduction of the Plantagenet kings that gets us to, a little bit later on, the division between the Lancastrian kings and the Yorkist kings. They all come from the line of Henry II. And that is later going to be the Wars of the Roses, which I've got somewhere down here. Okay? What else? It's under Henry II, totally French, okay? He only speaks French, doesn't understand English. It's under Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine that we see the rise, the beginning of a couple of traditions. The Romance tradition, the courtly love tradition, and the emphasis on what is now called chivalry, okay? Which is related to chevalier and cavalry, knights, horses, okay? I'm going to put up, I haven't done it yet, I'm going to do it today. I'm going to put up on D2L probably this document, but I'm also going to put up some of the rules of courtly love. And here's why. What we're going to read today, or what we're going to talk about, hopefully today, in L'Envol by Marie de France, and in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and in The Wife of Bath's Tale in Chaucer. They're all examples of courtly love literature or anti-courtly love literature. Some have argued for some of those, okay? So you have to understand this tradition of courtly love. So let me back up a minute. Eleanor of Aquitaine is the one who's largely responsible for this. She kind of set up within her little court, so to speak, her followers, what's been described as a religion of love, okay? Romantic, erotic love, not divine love, not love of God, okay? And they actually had, rituals, quote unquote, priests of love, not, orgies and bond, not that kind of stuff. There was a monk named Andreas Capellanus, about this same time period, who could read Latin, and he read Ovid, first century Rome. He read Ovid's Ars Amatoria. Ovid, who wrote Metamorphosis about the transformation of people and things and such. Well, Ovid also wrote a book called Ars Amatoria. Okay? In Ovid's little book, first century Rome, Ars Amatoria is a guide to men how to win women. Okay? But it's a satire. Because what Ovid is doing is he is satirizing the sexual mores of first century Rome. Which, even if you don't know anything specifically, floating around in the popular consciousness is this notion of wild decadence. I mean, orgies, yes. Just look up on, I shouldn't tell you to do this, but I will. Look up on YouTube, Caligula, BBC series. I think it was BBC. It's X-rated. Okay, I'll just warn you right now. It, just really X-rated, okay? But it's based on the life of Caligula and other Caesars and such. That's the kind of thing Ovid is satirizing. He's essentially holding this up because what does satire do? It holds up the follies, the foolishness, the foibles of people to show a mirror to nature, as Shakespeare will put it in Hamlet, to get them to reform their ways. I think I mentioned before, in talking about Old English, another Roman author, later than Ovid, Tacitus, who wrote a book called Germania. Okay? He was the one who, described how the soldiers, the Germans, would get ready to go into battle, and their wives and daughters and sisters would flash their breasts going, this is what you're fighting for, guys, etc., etc. He was the one who told us that German warriors would get drunk in their halls and slaughter each other. But he was doing that from a perspective of praising them, because he's comparing them with the Rome of his period. And he's saying, we're a bunch of drunken sots compared to these guys. These guys at least know what honor, nobility, so to speak, is. So Tacitus is doing a similar thing to what Ovid was doing at the Ars Amatoria. Here's the problem. Aquinas did not know this was satire. This would be like somebody today reading The Onion or what's the thing put out by the Christian group? It's not Sacramento Bee, that's the actual newspaper. Babylon Bee, something like that. Parody site, satire site online, has some of the greatest satire, out there. It'd be like somebody reading that and taking it to be truth, taking it to be entirely seriously, which, I'll just throw this out there, a lot of the so-called fact checkers have done. To look at something the Babylon Bee will say about Joe Biden, well, this is an untrue statement. It's like, no, you know what, Sherlock, it's supposed to be an untrue statement. It's parody. It is satire. He didn't know this was satire. And so he gleaned from this all these kinds of rules you ought to follow if you want to be kind of a courtly lover, okay? In the courtly love tradition, at its heart is, man, my brain is not working this morning. Adulterous. Adultery is its essence. And that's because Kapelanus, in his translation, essentially said, married love isn't romantic love. Married love is just for keeping the species going, the race going. Romantic love is to be found outside marriage. So you have your wife, you have your husband, but then you have your honey on the side, so to speak, okay? This gets developed into this noble ideal, okay? So, anybody know, one of you mentioned, having studied courtly love already, what's an example? Who's the greatest couple? As an example, do you know?
No.
Take a guess. Anybody? What couple in literature comes from this period? Give me an example of a knight and a lady.
Arthur and Lancelot.
Guinevere and Lancelot. Notice, not Arthur and Lancelot. Excuse me. But in our day and age, whatever, Not Arthur and Guinevere. Lancelot and Guinevere. Okay? Before Lancelot and Guinevere, in a sense, depending upon your timeline of the whole Arthurian message and stuff. An Irish version, Tristan and Isolde. That is an even greater example of the courtly love tradition. Because in Tristan and Isolde, Tristan is a guy who falls in love with a maiden named Isolde. She finds him shipwrecked. She brings him back to health. They woo each other. He woos her. Wins her hand in marriage. They don't get married. They are betrothed. She gets him back to health. He has to go back home to King Lot of Cornwall. King Lot hears about the daughter of this king, who's supposed to be beautiful and etc. And he sends Tristan to woo her for him. And it's Isolde. And she's like, great to see you. And he's not here for me. I'm here for my king. And she agrees to marry his king. Okay. And they're, keeping on a little action on the side. And they get discovered. Great film version. Trying to remember what year. Early 2000s, 2012, something like that. Can't remember the actors. Oh, man, I can't remember any of the actors. It's out there.
2006 film?
Yeah. Who plays King Lot? What's the guy's name?
Lot?
Or who plays Tristan? Harry?
Tristan, James Franco.
James Franco plays.
Henry Cavill's in it.
Henry Cavill's in it. Yeah, there's a bunch of great actors. The guy who plays the evil knight in A Knight's Tale plays King Lot, and he's a very sympathetic, he's a great King Lot. It's a great, great story, okay? But it has central to it, as all of these great romances do, the Liebestod theme, the love death. Because part of what courtly love ultimately says is, if you're going to have this passionate, romantic love, somebody's going to die. Lancelot and Guinevere. Arthur dies. And Lancelot and Guinevere, in some of the versions, die. In the main version, they each, Guinevere goes off, becomes a nun, Lancelot goes off, becomes a monk, and never the twain shall meet again, etc. What work by Shakespeare falls within this kind of theme? What work is foisted upon high school students? Romeo and Juliet, okay? Read Dante's Divine Comedy, and you have one of the greatest examples, Paolo and Francesca, third circle of hell, okay? Real people, they actually live, brother and sister-in-law, all right? But they fell in love, and her husband finds them in flagrante delicto, that is, doing what they shouldn't be doing, runs them through with a sword. And forever in eternity, they are chasing each other in the circle of hell that is given to passion. It's like a whirlwind. They can never quite touch each other. They're always longing for each other, all right? So the courtly love tradition had a set of rules. And again, the first one is, your wife or husband can't be your courtly lover. If you're a knight, who do you aim for? Queen, or the lady of your lord's domain, okay, his wife. And again, in the courtly love tradition, it's kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod. I don't know what's going on. Or as Shakespeare puts it in one of his sonnets, we suppose each other true. What does that word suppose mean? We know we're not, but we're going to pretend like we are. So you have your thing and I have my thing. So what does a knight do to win his lady's love? Watch A Knight's Tale. It's a great example. The character played by Heath Ledger does what? He goes off and he fights in these jousts. Well, the big one comes up and she says, if you really want to show me that you love me, lose. And he's like, what the? Lose. And he starts losing. And he gets the crap knocked out of him. And he's nearly dead, and her mistress is sent to him to tell him, now my lady says, if you really love me, win. He's like, wait a minute. Can't live with him, can't live without him. It's also part of the courtly love tradition, okay? And so he has to start trying to, beaten and battered, try to win, okay? A lot of people, when that film came out, it's like 2004, when that film came out, a lot of medievalists didn't like it initially, but it has grown in respect. I mean, it's really accurate in many, many ways, okay? It's not Chaucer's A Knight's Tale by any means. So I'm going to put up a list on D2L. I don't remember what it is, 25 or 50 of the rules of courtly love, okay? A courtly lover, and this is going to have repercussions for later literature. Petrarch will be influenced by this to some extent, okay? For example, Italian sonnet writer, who then influences the English sonnet tradition Shakespeare does. Shakespeare's going to take all of this and turn it on its head, to some extent. So what does a courtly lover do if he can't win his lady's hand? Okay, sometimes die, but not by suicide. He does what? He goes out and tries to do even more famous, fantastic feats. You find more within the literature. More dragons to slay, more ogres to more great battles to endure and such. And one of the big debates is, was this ever in actual human life real? Or is it all entirely a fiction? A literary fiction that we read in literary fictions. And the debate is still not quite clear, because we do have accounts of knights trying to win their lord's, lady's hand favor. But, basic primal things of human nature kind of say, she's mine, leave her alone, quit bothering her, or I'm going to kill you, and, having their knights killed, etc. Okay, so that's kind of courtly love. I'm going to put up, like I said, some of the rules. Also under the period of Henry II. Thank you, Devon, for reminding me, because I was going to talk about it and then completely slipped it when I was writing this down. Thomas Becket, okay, in 1170. Why is Thomas Becket important? Archbishop of Canterbury. He's important because we would not have a major work of English medieval literature if it weren't for him. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Why? Because nobody would have ever gone to Canterbury on pilgrimage. Backstory. Thomas of Becket and Henry II were good friends. Drinking buddies. Winching buddies. The whole 9 yards. All right? Even though Henry was married to Eleanor of Aquitaine. She, by the way, was called the Mother of Kings. Because she didn't only have Richard, she had John, she had the king who became king after John, if I remember correctly. She lived a long time. She was like in her 90s by the time she died. Really long life. In fact, John had her locked up. Yeah, because she was trying to pull the strings. She outlived him. So don't worry about that. I mean, got what was coming to him. So, Thomas and Becket. He and Henry were good friends. Like I said, they'd go to the whorehouses together, they'd go to pubs together, gaming, all that kind of stuff. Archbishop of Canterbury dies, and Henry's trying to think, who do I appoint Archbishop of Canterbury? Because it's with the king's prerogative. And he comes up with an idea. I'm going to put my BFF on the Archiepiscopal throne of Canterbury. Why? Largest landowner is not the king, it's not the crown, it's the church. And the church collects taxes. Henry's fighting wars. He needs money for those wars, among other reasons. Okay? So he tells Thomas, I'm going to name you Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket says, don't do it. Why not? Who better can I put? And Becket apparently told him, if you name me Archbishop of Canterbury, I will become the Archbishop of Canterbury. In other words, it won't just be a title. I will take it seriously. Okay? Henry doesn't believe him, makes him Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket actually fled England before this happened. Okay? Came back. He's made Archbishop. He seeks the advice of the Pope. There are 2 popes, by the way, at this point. There's one in Rome and there's one in Avignon, France. It's called the
Great Schism.
Louder?
Great Schism.
No, that's a different. That actually happened earlier. It's the papist. No, there's an actual phrase. It's like kidnapping, but it's not kidnapping. Anyways, he seeks advice from the Pope in Avignon, France. Okay, and then goes back. He's made Archbishop. Then, if he doesn't take the job seriously, he becomes a true, quote-unquote, vicar of Christ. Vow of poverty, he no longer chases women, he no longer drinks, the whole 9 yards. He doesn't do what Henry wants him to do. Okay? Again, he flees. He goes to France. Again, seeks advice from the Pope. Pope says, you got to go back. You know, the church is without its shepherd if you're not there, etc. He goes back, and one evening, 1170, late December, after a long period of consternation between Henry II and Becket, it is recorded that Henry II said, kind of in a drunken stupor, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" His best friend, former best friend. And 3 of his knights get on horseback from London, and they ride to Canterbury. Word has reached Becket that they're coming. He goes to the cathedral at Canterbury. You can go to the spot today. They have this god-awful, ugly, modernist sculpture where he died. 3 swords. And he starts to pray at the altar. And they cut him down, literally, on the altar. They scatter his blood all over the altar. Word gets back to Henry II what happened, and he's like, I didn't mean it. I was drunk. Okay? To show his contrition, Henry II rides to Canterbury. He gets to the city walls, he gets off his horse, he gets on his hands and feet. It's snowy. This is January now, because that's like December 28th to December 29th, I think it was, in 1170. He gets on his hands and knees and he crawls from the city walls to the cathedral, okay, as an act of penance. The Pope beatifies Thomas of Becket, I think it is within 11 or 12 years. It's one of the shortest periods that someone has to wait from death to beatification, raised to the level of a saint in the Catholic Church, at least from the Middle Ages on. All right? From that point on, from the point of his beatification, people start coming to Canterbury on pilgrimage. Okay? And that's why we get the Canterbury Tales.
Wait, is this the St. Thomas? Like the St. Thomas?
You might be thinking of St. Thomas Aquinas.
Okay.
There's St. Thomas Aquinas is a quote-unquote doctor of the church. He wrote the Summa Theologica, 1,000 questions with 1,000 answers, etc., etc. Different St. Thomas. That's a Italian saint.
Okay.
Also very pious, also discussed greatly in Dante's Divine Comedy. Becket is also in Dante's Divine Comedy. Okay? But Becket is a thoroughly English within the realm of England saint. He's French, but, English, all right? So, Henry lives 19 years after that, and then he dies. Henry's got a couple of sons, actually more than that. His eldest son, Richard Coeur de Lion, his real name to the English is, what's Coeur de Lion? Heart of the Lion. Richard the Lionheart becomes king. This is the Richard in the Robin Hood stories.
Good
All right.
King Richard?
Good King Richard. Okay? Of that 10-year reign, he only spent 6 months in England. Go to Parliament today, and outside Parliament, between Parliament and Westminster Cathedral, there's this big brass statue, sculpture, and it's of Richard the Lionheart on horse. He's still held as, this great English king. He didn't give a rat's you-know-what for England. What was he doing the other 9 years and 6 months? He was off fighting the Crusades. Okay? But he's held as, great king, etc. He dies, his brother becomes king. And you all know this story because at some point in your life you have probably watched the Walt Disney version of Robin Hood, which has Richard and John the First, soon to be called John the Worst. There's a little song there in that. But again, John is the bad king in all the Robin Hood stories, films, etc. His nickname is Lackland. Why? Because he loses land. John, in 1204, loses Normandy to the French. When he loses Normandy, what that means is the English crown now no longer has any land holdings in France. See, from his father on, even going back to 1066, William of Normandy became King of England. He doesn't give up his Norman duchy at that point, which is, it creates a tension, right? Because if you're the Duke of a territory, because of the feudal system, Feudal, what does that mean? You might be king of another land, but because you are Duke of a piece of property, that means your duchy falls underneath the king of the land that duchy is part of. So he is King of England, but vassal to King of France. Well, no king wants to be a vassal to anybody. I'm king of all, so to speak. That's what creates this ongoing tension between the King of England and the King of France. Well, it goes on. Henry II has battles. Okay? They lose Aquitaine between Henry II's time and John's time. John, 1204, loses Normandy. This is huge. Why? This is the ancestral homeland for all of these French kings who trace their lineage ultimately back to William of Normandy. All right? 1215, John is forced to sign Magna Carta. What's Magna Carta?
Great Charter.
Means Great Charter. What is it?
It limited the monarchy.
It limited the monarchy's power. It gives power to the barons, and it gives power to us. What, for example, is something that is in Magna Carta that gets brought into the United States Constitution?
We the people.
Okay, we the people partly. What else? Trial by jury of one's peers. See, peer back here, though, doesn't mean what we mean it to mean. If you are a peer, you are a lord. You're a knight. Okay? But now it's taken to mean of one's equals, so to speak. Same kind of thing then. See, you didn't have some peasant brought off the field to sit on a jury to hear a case having to do with a baron or duke. No, it was the other barons and dukes who would sit on the jury to hear that case. If it was a peasant, supposedly it was supposed to be other peasants would hear that case. Not always how it worked out. Okay? So that curtails the power of the king. It increases the power of Parliament because it says Parliament must meet at certain times, etc. All right? Pretty important in terms of the development of constraining the power of the court. From 1337, so that's 1215. Notice I'm skipping over a big chunk of history. Why? Because you just have kings after that and squabbles between them, etc. I'm going to jump up. 14th century. 100 Years' War begins, 1337, goes on for over 100 years. mid-1450s, between England and France. Notice, there's battles going on all the way back here, squabbling over territory and such. But it breaks out into full-blown open war in the mid-1330s. Chaucer is born in the mid-1340s, okay? When Chaucer is, I think, 16 years old, he goes off on a mission and is captured in France. He's ransomed by Richard II. Excuse me. He is ransomed by, it's not Richard II, it's Richard's father. No, Henry V is earlier. I should know. Richard II is, no, that's Henry IV. By Edward III. He's ransomed by Edward III. And that's telling us a couple things. Whatever it was Chaucer was doing as a 16-year-old, it was pretty important. Okay? That the king actually paid for the ransom. 1340s, 50s, the Black Death starts in North Africa, goes from North Africa throughout Europe. Anybody know what the estimates are of the number of people dead? COVID was nothing, literally. Roughly a third of the population of Europe. Okay? So think of the United States, roughly 330 million. Take out California, Texas, Florida. California is about 42 million. Texas is 30-something. Florida's 20-something. Yeah, you still got to get probably New York and Illinois. Just kill them all. It's huge. What happens as a result of the Black Death? First of all, where does it hit? Big populated areas. Why? Because it is spread through close contact. It is spread through air and through fluid. It came from fleas on rats, and we now are pretty sure it came from what is now modern day Kazakhstan. Okay? Actually know the name of the very specific kind of Yersinia pestis or something like that. All right? It wipes out and decimates the cities, which, in one way of looking at it, perspective is a very funny thing. It's a good thing for some people. If you want to quote A Knight's Tale, change your stars. Because astrology at this point, it's not called astrology. It's just called science. And how the world works. The sign, the star, the planet you were born under influences your life. But so to change your stars is to rearrange the cosmological map, so to speak. How can you do that? If you're born into a certain position of life, and that's the same position your father was born into, and his father, well, if the cities get wiped out, to some extent at least, but there are still people needed to do certain tasks in the cities, but most of the people are now dead, what does that create? Opportunity. Job openings. Okay? So that you have, at this period, the beginning of the rise of the middle class. Because people leave farms, they leave rural areas, they move into the cities, okay, and they take on new positions. They create new positions. So the middle class starts to gain some power and influence. You have the rise of guilds as a result, medieval unions, that's what the guild essentially was. It guarantees certain jobs, it guarantees certain rates for those jobs. If you become a wheelwright, it guaranteed that you were paid a certain amount of money, if you remember the guild, for the wheel that you produced. Or if you were a coppersmith or brassmith or goldsmith, same kind of thing. Okay? So that's, Black Death. 1377, Edward III dies. His son, Richard II, becomes king. Okay? Introduces some reforms, introduces some laws, doesn't, largely because of Shakespeare, he's kind of viewed as a pretty narcissistic individual. And there's probably a reason why Shakespeare portrayed him that way. And that's, some of the evidence shows that's the kind of person he was. He surrounded himself with people who supposedly loved him and praised him. Okay? He didn't pay attention to hot spots around him, meaning foreign hot spots, foreign problems. He also didn't pay attention to some local problems. Okay? He dies, where is he? In 1399. Is that an accurate way of describing his demise? Have any of you read Richard II or Henry IV Part 1?
Doesn't he like kind of end up in prison in some way?
He's deposed
Yeah.
by, I don't think I have it up here. Yes, I do. Henry Bolingbroke. Okay. He's deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, and he dies in prison. He's actually killed. Okay. Read Richard II and Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, one of Shakespeare's history tetralogies, and Henry V to get the fourth one. It's during his reign that in 1381 you have the Peasants' Revolt. Wat Tyler is the leader of the Peasants' Revolt. And the peasants were revolting because they didn't think they were getting a fair shake. 1381 Peasants' Revolt was like I don't remember the exact years, what was it, 2008, 2009, Occupy Wall Street. They were wanting fairer wages, better working conditions, the whole 9 yards. And Richard agreed to meet. And then Adam slaughtered. You can go to the space, what's the name of that field? Field outside London where it occurred. Okay? Did not go down well. That is, was not well received by the thinkers of the period. Chaucer has some allusions to the Peasants' Revolt. John Gower does. Lyman, who writes, not Lyman, the guy who writes Piers Plowman, whose name is escaping me for some reason. Piers Plowman is an allegory, and it's largely about the excesses of the church and of the government. Piers Plowman. Piers, French version for Peter. Okay? Plowman tells us this guy does what for a living? He works the fields. Okay? And it's about his experiences. And this work is highly critical of both the church in England at the time and of the government in England at the time. And it raises and it praises common, ordinary, everyday folks. Okay? Chaucer does the same in a couple of his things. 1350 to 1375 or so is a period of what's called the alliterative revival. And that, for some reason, we don't know why, in the northwest of England, you had a group of writers start writing in alliterative verse. And what it appeared, Piers Plowman, for example, is written during this period, and it follows this alliteration pattern. And it appears that what they were attempting to do, partially at least, was to revive the Old English alliterative meter. The problem is, they didn't know what it was, or they didn't understand it. You have a line in Piers Plowman that reads, in a fair field full of folk found I there. Fair field full folk found. 1, 2, 3, 4, you've got 5 alliterative sounds there. In the Old English alliterative tradition, for those of you who remember, you had a minimum of 2 alliterating words, a maximum of 3. The 4th stress never alliterated. Here you have 5. Chaucer is going to ridicule this in, well, a couple of tales. He has the tale of Sir Topas, which is the tale told by the pilgrim, Geoffrey Chaucer. Okay? Not the author, but the imagined, created pilgrim character. He's going to tell a tale kind of like this. And others are going to ridicule him. All right? Going to make fun of this kind of excessive use of alliteration. Because if you can imagine something like this going on for a few thousand lines, it gets very repetitive, very dull. Okay? So, alliterative revival, roughly in that period. The greatest work of this, okay, is found in manuscript Cotton Nero A10, which is called either the Pearl manuscript or the Gowan manuscript, because it contains the poem, The Pearl, and it contains Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It also contains two other poems, Patience and Purity. Okay? Patience and Purity, they're entirely didactic. Okay? The Pearl poem and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight are two great works of the alliterative revival. The Pearl poem is one of the greatest dream visions poems in the English language. And Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is one of the greatest, some would say, I'm kind of with disagreement, the greatest romance in the English language. Okay? Which we'll talk about when we get to that. Chaucer dies in 1400. Chaucer's pretty influential. 85. There are 85 full-length manuscripts of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales that survive from 1400. And there are fragments of other versions of them. The only problem is, in those manuscripts, the Canterbury Tales are arranged differently. There's like one group of manuscripts will have their tales arranged in one way, another group of manuscripts has them arranged another way, and another group of manuscripts has them arranged another way. We don't know which of those arrangements of tales Chaucer actually intended upon his death. We don't have the poem, we don't have the Canterbury Tales in his own handwriting. We do have some other stuff in his own handwriting. So it kind of creates problems for trying to understand how to read the Canterbury Tales, because a lot of the tales are different. Some of the tales, you have, for example, a marriage group, series of tales that all seem to be about marriage. Okay? Anyways, Chaucer dies. 1399 to 1416, I mentioned. Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, deposes Richard II, claims the crown for himself, becomes Henry IV. This is, I think it's relatively safe to say, this is the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. Or this sets the seed for the Wars of the Roses. That real period of warfare won't open up until about the 1460s. But it happens because a Lancastrian, make sure I have that right. Pretty sure, actually, I don't have that right. Yeah. Henry IV is a Lancastrian, but so is Richard II. Henry IV dies, 1416. His son becomes Henry V. Okay? Read Shakespeare's play. Henry V has been called the most loved of English kings. Remember when I said come back to here, Norman becomes the dominant language? He is, I don't have him here, Henry V is the first of these kings, okay, from 1066 following, he's the first of these kings to grow up speaking only English. In fact, you get to the end of Shakespeare's play, Henry V, and we hear Henry speaking French with Catherine of France, and his French is halting. It's not good. Okay? Henry IV knew English, but he didn't grow up speaking it. He learned it, kind of as a second language almost, or this is his, when he becomes king, not when he's born. He's born a lot earlier. All right? 1453, Gutenberg invents printable press, moving press over in Germany. That's going to become important later. And then 1485, to kind of round off just the historical stuff, which is why I have this date up here. 1485, you have what's called the Battle of Bosworth Field. It's the end of the Wars of the Roses. All right? Henry Tudor defeats Richard III in a famous battle. Shakespeare immortalizes it and immortalizes Richard III with the words, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Give me a horse and you can have the kingdom. Why? I'll ride away to safety. Richard dies, and nobody knows what happened to him after that until around 2012, I think it was.
Didn't they dig up his...
2000, I think it was 2012. In Leicester, England, they were doing construction for a car park, British for a parking lot, and they discovered, digging up this area, they knew at one point in the Middle Ages there had been a priory or a monastery there, but a lead coffin is found. Okay? Lead coffin implies whoever was buried in this, pretty important. And there's remains in the coffin. The remains are male, and the remains show that this guy had really bad scoliosis. Curvature of the spine. Okay? Shakespeare's portrayal of Richard III is most notable for his description of him as a hunchback. Why? Because a hunchback, Shakespeare's day and earlier, was a sign of your evil nature. And Shakespeare portrays Richard III as entirely evil. He's doing that for a reason. The monarch that Shakespeare is writing under at that time, when Shakespeare writes Richard III in the early 1590s, is Elizabeth the First, but what's her last name? Elizabeth Tudor. Her grandfather was Henry VII, who defeated, Henry VII, who defeated Richard III. I mean, Shakespeare's plays, he plays up, he celebrates the Tudor line and everything. Some of us, I would call a lot of what he does in those plays as propaganda. I mean, he's getting on the good side of the Queen and such, okay? Well, anyways, 2012, they're doing this construction work, and this coffin is found. Body's taken out, the remains are taken out. They're analyzed, and lo and behold, about 2 years later, it's announced, we have found the remains of Richard III. He was buried in an unmarked grave. Leicester has since gone on, and at the cathedral in Leicester, he has been interred. And there's a monument in the cathedral, Okay? What little survives from Richard III's reign. Why would little survive? He didn't reign that long. He only reigned for 2 or 3 years. What goes to the victors of war? Spoils and louder? The story. You get to tell the narrative of who won. Okay? One of the ways you tell that narrative is to do what? We know this historically. This has happened all over the place.
Destroy any documentation of an alternative.
When Orwell wrote 1984 and 1948, he wasn't just pulling this idea out of thin air of rewriting history. He knew this is what happened. He was just kind of trying to show the mid-20th century what's happening now. It's happening on a scale never seen before. Soviet Union kind of thing. Who knows what Orwell would say? Well, I know what Orwell would say, but I'm not going to go there. Anyways, it appears that a lot of the historical record during Richard III's reign was destroyed. What does survive shows a couple of things. One, he was a pretty good administrator. That is, he knew how to run something. He was a good CEO, in other words. And two, it appears he was fairly well liked. He wasn't the monster Shakespeare portrayed him to be. Also interesting, Richard III, the play, it's where we get the idea of the 2 little princes killed in the Tower of London. The 2 little princes who were challenges to his claim of the throne. Mid-1930s, 2 young boy skeletons were discovered in the Tower of London. It's thought that they are the 2 little princes that Shakespeare alludes to in the play. So, Bosworth, Battle of Bosworth Field, 1485. Henry Tudor defeats Richard III and is crowned Henry VII. And we have the beginning of the Tudor monarchy, which goes from 1485 all the way up to 1603, when Queen Elizabeth dies. She dies, her cousin, James VI of Scotland, becomes James I of England, and he introduces the Stuart monarchy, which is then going to go for about another roughly 65 years, with a little period of break. Yes?
So how do the numbers work? So you said Henry VI changed to Henry I?
No. James VI of Scotland. Sorry, if I said Henry, I misspoke. James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England.
So how does that number work?
He was the 6th king named James of Scotland. Totally separate monarchy, totally different nation, so to speak. When he becomes king of England, he's the first king in England named James. And at that point, he's king of both countries.
So like Henry IV, like he's not.
He's only the 4th person named Henry as king of England. He doesn't have any other territories.
So Henry III was his father.
Henry III was his father. Yep. Yep. Well, no. Take that back. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Just like today, the current king of England. What's his name? Charles III. But his father was not Charles II.
Wow.
His father was Prince Philip. A lot of people are like, why the hell did you even choose to go by the name Charles, first of all? Because Charles the First, he got his head chopped off by Parliament. And Charles II did not have that great of a reign, known by scandal, if nothing else. Okay? So Henry III, I've actually got it. Henry III was actually 1216 to 72. So a full 100 years before Henry the Fourth. It's just when one becomes king, you can choose the name you're going to take. For example, one of Charles's names is Arthur.
Why wouldn't you pick that?
Think about it for a moment.
King Arthur.
Who the hell is going to have the you-know-whats to call himself King Arthur? What are you going to do? Have a Merlin as your advisor also? Or, you know?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Go down
not
in
this one.
history.
I could imagine William, because I'm pretty sure William has Arthur in his name also. Henry VIII, who we haven't talked about, we don't have time. Henry VIII has Arthur in his, no, take that back. Henry VIII has an older brother named Arthur. Henry marries that brother's wife after that brother dies because it's claimed they never consummated the marriage because he died like 6 months within marrying her. Okay, Catherine of Aragon, if I remember correctly. And they don't produce a male heir who comes from her. Mary, which just creates all kinds of problems. But anyways, back to Henry for a second. Henry VIII had built for Winchester Cathedral, apparently, a round table. You can go to Winchester Cathedral and see this table. It still exists. It's over 500 years old. Okay? And at the seat that Arthur holds in the round table, the image, because each of the seats has a portrait, if I remember correctly. Arthur's portrait, it's Henry VIII's face. What's he doing? I mean, talk about your propaganda. He's, I am that king, so to speak. Okay? And he was very apparently quite good looking when he was a young man. When he got into his 30s and 40s, he was about the most grotesque human being who ever lived. I mean, grossly fat and overweight. Had to be lifted on a crane to be put on horseback. I'm serious.
I thought it was because he was hard, like his leg was literally injured.
No, he was like 500 pounds upon death. It's 400 or 500 pounds upon death. You can go to the Tower of London and you can see the evolution of Henry's armor. And when he was like 18 years old, I mean, he's like Mr. Incredible. And then when he's in his 40s, it's like a pot-bellied stove. I
That
mean,
man had the audacity to kill how many wives?
he could have killed more in other ways if you think about it. Anyways, okay, so let's stop there and go back to Henry II, courtly love. Eleanor of Aquitaine had among her retinue of ladies a woman named Marie de France. Her name simply means Marie of France. Well, they were all of France, essentially. But anyways, and Marie de France wrote a collection of stories. They're called lays. These are Breton lays. Why? Because they are of a style from the northern coast of France that is today called Brittany. She apparently spoke the Breton dialect. Okay? Breton lays are characterized, they're one of the genres of Middle English literature, even though they're not literally in Middle English. The real ones, at least. Kind of modern fantasy. You have a love element, an erotic romance interest, okay? You have a supernatural element, and they almost all, as part of that supernatural element, well, you have a supernatural, or let me say, fairy element, okay? And there's often a quest. See, two of those elements that I've just mentioned are also elements of romance poems or literature. The quest and the love element. Not all romances have, however, a fairy or supernatural element. We're going to see Sir Down in the Green Knight does. Right? Because a guy gets his head lopped off and then picks it up and keeps talking and rides away with it. That doesn't happen around these parts.
The movie, did you like the movie?
Sir Gawain the Green Knight? I haven't seen it.
The A24 movie, it's really, I like it a lot.
Huh, I'll have to check it out.
It's on Showtime.
Okay. So, Marie wrote a series of Breton lays. Bisclaveret is one, for example, about a werewolf. Pretty cool. The one we're going to read, L'Envol, becomes the source of a native English version by a guy named Sir Thomas Leicester, Thomas of Chester, okay, name of the town. And his is called Sir Launfal. And there's motifs in this poem that are pretty important, okay, or that get followed. L'Envol, and you've got it in both the Breton version in the English translation in your textbook. L'Envol is what kind of story? That is, who is it about? And I don't mean who, the character named L'Envol. The culture that the character is part of.
Oh, like the King Arthur's.
Arthur's court. So this is showing us, by this period, Arthur's already around. Chrétien de Troyes, French author, is writing just a little bit earlier than this, in up to and including the same time. Okay, where does the whole Arthur story come from? We don't know. Geoffrey of Monmouth mentions in 13th century, 1200s, he mentions Arthur as this great English king. Okay, but he doesn't tell us much about him. It's from Geoffrey of Monmouth that we get some of the stuff about Merlin and Uther Pendragon, etc., etc. There's a couple of earlier Welsh writers, Gildas in the 6th century, Nennius in the 9th century, that make reference possibly to him. Nennius definitely. Gildas, not quite so sure about. That this guy is a Saxon, either a Saxon king or a Romano-British king fighting against the Saxon invaders. Okay? Myth, we don't know. I kind of think there's probably some historical figure that is the basis for the myth. Anyways, L'Envol. What's it about? What's the brief overstory, the brief plot? Anybody?
L'Envol is kind of wooed by this fairy queen. He's completely in love with her. She tells him, "Don't tell anyone of our love." He promises not to. And then Guinevere tries to seduce him, and he's like, "No, because I have a love that's twice as great as you." And then he gets accused of seducing Guinevere, and but now Fairy Queen won't show up because he broke his promise, and except then she does.
And then she does. Notice, by the way, the key thing there. He promised to keep their love a secret. That is way up at the top of rules of courtly love. You never reveal your love to those outside. Okay? John Donne's going to talk about that a little bit in one of his poems. About not revealing our love. The language he's going to use is different. Not revealing our love to the laity, the uninitiate, so to speak. Okay? So one of those rules of courtly love is you keep your relationship totally secret. And it's a promise. You break that promise, you're screwed. You're out. All right? So notice what we have there. We got the character L'Envol. We're going to be told he's the son of a king, but he's at Arthur's court. He's disfavored for some reason by Arthur. We're not told why. That is, Arthur doesn't give him gifts like he gives to everybody else. And so L'Envol does something that we get warned in Middle English literature you should be wary of doing. He gets on his horse because he's frustrated, and he rides off, and he gets off his horse in a meadow near a stream with a tree nearby. And he gets off his horse, and he sits down, and he falls asleep.
Absolutely
And he wakes up. And suddenly, there are three beautiful women coming to him. They take him to their mistress's pavilion. Like, they're getting ready for a tournament. And she is not just some fairy lover, she is the queen of the fairies. Okay? And what does she offer him? Me. You can have me. And it's pretty descriptive, the language that's used. She's a looker. Okay? She's wearing see-through clothing, essentially. And he's like, cool. But big proviso. You got to keep it a secret. Which he does. Until Guinevere comes in. And what does Guinevere do? She pulls a Potiphar's wife. What does that mean?
It's a reference to Joseph.
Joseph, Book of Genesis.
Yeah, so Joseph, after his brother sold him into slavery, he was a slave in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's wife was kind of like, dude, you're hot, sleep with me, and he was like,
I think that's the actual version in the Hebrew. Dude, you're hot. Go ahead.
And he was like, no, and he books it, and she's running after him, and yeah.
Because when he leaves, she grabs onto his cloak
And it makes
and pulls it off, so he's running away naked. She's like, look, he left his cloak behind here. I'm totally innocent. Okay? Guinevere does the same thing. What does that tell us about Guinevere in the poem? We'll talk about the poem in detail on Thursday. Okay, one thing that, we have this idea in popular kind of mythological consciousness or popular culture consciousness that, Guinevere, she's this great queen. In most medieval literature, outside Thomas Malory, and even in some of Malory,
She seems to be like a troublemaker.
that's a very polite way of putting it.
She's the instigator.
She's a tramp.
Oh, that's one way to say it.
No, I'm not kidding. There's another poem. I'm trying to remember the title of it, and I can't remember the title of it, where there's a drinking game. Arthur and his men are sitting around the round table, and a drinking horn is passed around. But the drinking horn has a spell about it. And the spell is, if you make a lie, if you say a lie when the horn comes to you, and you try to drink from the horn, it's not going to go in your mouth, you're going to spill it. And so what they're doing in this particular game is they're talking about the faithfulness of their women friends, let's put it. And it comes to Arthur, and Arthur talks about Guinevere's fidelity. And it's like he doesn't even get the horn close enough to touch his lips, and it's just spewing liquid out. Okay? Pretty much telling us, she's a slut, man. There's no other way to put it. If it moves, she'll sleep with it. Kind of. 2 legs, maybe 4, who knows. But if it moves, Guinevere's going to do it. Okay? That comes out in several medieval poems. Now, to be fair to Guinevere's character, most of these works fall along kind of like the fableau, the parody, the burlesque, where you're taking another genre, like the romance, and you're turning it on its head. Chaucer, for example, opens the Canterbury Tales, The Miller's Tale. The Miller's Tale is this great romance about 2 guys who fall in love with the same woman, and they have to fight to the death to win her hand. Okay? That's the Knight's Tale. Sorry, did I say Miller's Tale? That's the Knight's Tale. The miller then interrupts the proceedings. Drunk as a skunk. And I'm going to tell my tale. And they say, go ahead. He turns it on its head, where he has 2 guys fall in love with the same woman. One of the guys is an old man who's married to her, and the other guy is a young lech, for lack of a better term, who just wants to get in her pants. There's another guy who also wants to get in her pants. And the whole thing's about how she pulls the wool over her husband's eyes and gives this one guy Nicholas everything that he wants from her, and this other guy, Absalom, doesn't get anything. In other words, she's playing the field. Okay? What has the Miller just done? He's taking the quote-unquote noble idea of this high romance and just completely made it base. Why? Because he doesn't live up here in the high noble world of the knights and the ladies and the courtly love tradition. He lives down here in the muck of everyday life. Okay, we'll stop there. We'll do Lawnval on Thursday. All of Lawnval. Starts are down in the Green Knight.